The so-called wealthy countries have agreed to pull at least $300 billion a year by 2035 to help developing nations bear a disproportionate burden from climate change. It falls far short of the $1.3 trillion initially asked by developing countries, who say the final pledge is a paltry sum. Well, to discuss, let's bring in climate analyst and researcher Anabella Rosemberg. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today. It's been a rocky road, but we have a deal that's been pushed through. Do you see this as a step in the right direction or nowhere near enough to help developing nations deal with climate change?
Unfortunately, from a civil society perspective and taking into account the needs for adapting to climate change, transitioning away from fossil fuels, this deal cannot be seen as progress. It is a failure and it is a step backward in the right direction.
So the amount that's been agreed upon is $300 billion. So then what can realistically be achieved with this amount? You say this is a failure. How so?
$300 billion is basically what is already being mobilized around the world. What the agreement is saying is that we need trillions, so it acknowledges the need, but then it moves on into saying that developed country governments would just lead in trying to mobilize 300 billion and also counting a lot of money that is already out there, in particular multilateral development banks that are already roughly planning to mobilize those things in form of debt to developing countries. With a little bit of creative accounting, developed countries can reach that amount even much faster of the pledge that is currently on the text, where they are committing only to reach that amount 10 years from now. It's not even from this year onwards. So no matter where we look, the text is so full of loopholes that yes, we can be attracted to see the numbers, but behind those numbers, there's no clear commitment to see new public money going from developed countries to developing countries, which was the deal that allowed developing countries to accept the Paris Agreement. So this is also the most worrying signal. We went to Baku to have an agreement on climate finance. And in the end, what we have coming back this morning, after 2 weeks of bitter negotiations, as you said, is a rewriting of the responsibilities of developed countries to support the transition. And this is, I have to say, quite unfortunate, because it has been the plan in the books for a long time to erase that historical responsibility of developed countries. And again, this is something that does not only harm developing country peoples, but actually everyone around the world, because we are going to be seeing less action on climate change.
Now, continuing on what you just said, climate change is one of the most pressing issues of our lifetime and for the next generations. But as we just saw at the summit, it's fair to say that the issue still lacks momentum. So how do you explain this hesitation and the lack of drive on the climate front?
I think it's very important to acknowledge that the way in which climate policies have been done until now have not really touched people's direct life and direct concerns. A lot of the climate policies that are out there are very techno-centered and not really responding to the needs for food, for water, for income, for jobs. So as long as climate remains separated from other people's concerns, we are going to be seeing it in competition with other prosperity demands. So I think we need to launch a new era of talking and doing climate action that just moves us away from what elites has been trying to push, which is an agenda that sustains them in the investments and ideas of the economies that privilege them, and move away from that to respond to people's needs. In that way, we can get much more popular support, not only for climate action, but for transforming the way in which our societies are organized, which ultimately is what we need to confront the climate challenge and reach the 1.5 degree average target goal that the Paris Agreement set for us all.
So in that case, how can developing countries be helped by richer countries for an ecological transition? Could you perhaps give some examples?
Well, what we are saying is that there are possibilities of a different kind of partnership. And I think on the one side, there is the money, and clearly this deal is not responding to that need. On the other side, there is also the need for international cooperation and changing the rules in which that cooperation is happening. The Indian government yesterday in their speech, they were saying, well, we are in a very hostile environment to organize our transition. There is a trade fight going on, preventing developing countries from add domestic content, for example, to the clean technology production. So we could also see cooperation coming beyond money. And that's another way to support countries, is to rewrite some of the rules that today don't allow some of these poorest countries to jump into a different sort of economy.
And another glaring issue is, of course, the incoming US President, Donald Trump, who's expected to pull out of the Paris Agreement. So, how are other developed nations expected to make up for the shortfall in the pledge?
What we have seen in the past 2 weeks, is that the election of Donald Trump in the U.S. presidency was used to somehow push developing countries to accept any kind of deal, because later we would have Trump, or later we would have different, even worse domestic conditions in Europe. I think this is not necessarily the narrative we need, or what should drive diplomacy. What we are going to see, and of course, in the US, is a weakening of some of their standards. And that's the most worrying concern. When it comes to multilateralism, unfortunately, the United States has not been a good partner to the climate agreement. Sometimes it has a more positive narrative, sometimes less. But when it comes to commitments, whether it's about emission reductions or finance, they have kept on lagging behind and trying to erase their historical responsibility. So I think it's very important that the rest of the developed world in particular not only tries to make up for the US, but actually tries to establish a different kind of partnership with the developing world. That is what is missing, a willingness to rebuild diplomacy in a way that goes beyond putting at the table text that is clearly harming developing country interests and expecting them to accept for the sake of multilateralism, because this is what has been happening over the past years, and this is something that we need to change if we want the UN to survive in these very hostile political changes that we are observing.
Now, this year's summit, of course, took place as, 2024 is almost certain to be the hottest ever year on record, isn't it? I mean, all the many, natural disasters brought on by extreme weather is just going to become worse and worse, isn't it?
It's going to become worse and worse. We know this, but we can still change things as well. We can change things first. We can redirect, the way in which we are organizing our societies. We can also start collecting money. I think a lot of the conversation about the finance goal has been about developed countries making efforts to put money on the table, but we know that they are not taking the money there where it's needed, and I think that could also help. We also know that we need societies that stay stronger together. The disasters we've seen in the global south, but also more recently in Europe, in Valencia, for example, show that people also want to help each other. Adaptation policies are going to be crucial. And again, reinforcing the social fabric that would allow us to think together which kind of society we want to build. All of those messages about what we're calling is a just transition are also being erased of the agreement in Baku. And that is also a very, very sad message to communities and people around the world that are not only facing the impacts of climate change, but are also being asked to pay for it.
Anabella Rosemberg, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on the program today.
Thanks so much for your invitation.